So we've got a net increase of 72. There are now 332 total cumulative cases with an unknown source that indicate community transmission. That's an increase of 31 since yesterday. And now 415 active cases in Victoria, an increase of 45 since yesterday. Perhaps not unexpectedly, there are now 20 patients hospitalised, an increase of 5 since yesterday, including 4 in intensive care, which is an increase of 2. Total testing numbers, 856,591 to date. That's an increase of 26,320 since yesterday. Happy to take questions.
Are these all in the hot zones?
They are largely in the hot zones, as it were, but not exclusively. One of the issues is people do move around a little bit. Obviously now with the restrictions in force, people should be limiting their movement to the fullest extent possible, only leaving home for those 4 reasons. But prior to this, obviously people have moved around and seen people in other suburbs, and so some of those cases, and they're a minority, are outside of those so-called hot zones.
We had a net increase yesterday of 27 cases outside the hot zones. How likely do you think it is that we're going to have to shut down other postcodes?
I really hope we don't have to. I think, I'm really emphasising that even though these restrictions are in place in those restricted postcodes, there's an obligation on all of us to consider how we minimise our interactions with other people. And so though the stay-at-home directions apply to those restricted postcodes, all of us across Victoria have to really consider whether we need to see people in other settings, other households, including family members and friends. That will be the best mitigation against new postcodes being included. But those criteria that have been used for the restricted postcodes to date are the same criteria that we would apply to other postcodes. So it's really up to all of the residents there, all of us across Victoria, to ensure that we can keep those numbers down so that no new postcodes need to be considered for restrictions.
And just on that, we had a net increase of 8 in the city of Melbourne yesterday. We only had 3 cases in hotel quarantine. Why are we seeing such a big increase in the CBD?
I'm not sure what the specifics of those who weren't in quarantine relate to, but I'm happy to come back to you, Rachel.
What did you tell the government in terms of how they should operate hotel quarantine? Do you know whose recommendation it was that security companies should run them?
It wasn't mine. I haven't been involved in the governance and operation, but it was, jointly oversighted by Emergency Management within DHHS, Emergency Management Victoria, Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions.
Are you involved in the governance and management now? You said you weren't, but are you involved now?
In the management of hotel quarantine? No, not specifically in terms of its governance and operation. It's a very large logistic exercise. There are infection prevention and control staff in the broader division in which I sit, who are obviously advising very closely on those specific matters and are going out to provide training as well.
Do you think it's been blocked, hotel quarantine?
Look, there's an inquiry that's upcoming. That is, I have not been involved in it. I think it's entirely appropriate that the judicial inquiry goes to all of the issues that might be at play here.
The Ruby Princess inquiry was held really quickly and it was open and everybody could hear what was said, which meant that everybody could still learn those lessons while it was an active emergency. Should the same happen here so that everybody can learn from our mistakes?
Oh, look, that's a matter for government.
But that would be helpful, wouldn't it?
I'm sure it'll be helpful to have as timely reporting on what the issues identified are, but that's been a continuous process through this for government anyway, and obviously the reports back on infection prevention and control have routinely been made to government.
Do you know if these 77 cases are the same genomic sequence as what's come out of quarantine, or is it too early?
So again, the genomics report that the Premier referenced and that I provided advice to him on is from the Peter Doherty Institute, who do that sequencing. It's not my report to share, and it hasn't been updated since what I provided to the Premier and Minister this week.
Would you expect, though, a large number of those community transmissions that you spoke about earlier would
Oh, I think we have to see. I wouldn't second guess what the genomics is going to show in another week or 2 weeks' time, but we will analyse and review that with interest, obviously.
Are you aware if any security guards did sleep with people in quarantine?
I do not have any personal information about operations in quarantine, but as I say, it's entirely appropriate for the judicial inquiry to look into every and all aspect, and I'm sure that will be a process that's undertaken.
Is it appropriate that security guards are still in charge of managing guests who are
Not for me to say, honestly. This is all a matter for the inquiry, and they will make recommendations, I'm sure, fearlessly and fairly.
Just on the genomic testing strain, is there any indication that the strain we have in Melbourne is perhaps more virulent than what's going on in Sydney or other parts of the country, which is why we have this spread?
So yeah, in relation to the strain that might be predominating in Melbourne at the moment, I don't think there's any evidence that it's more virulent. I think the evidence that we have from overseas, where there's more transmission or faster transmission, really relates to how people are behaving and the cohort of the population that are infected. I don't think it's a feature of the virus at all.
And will you be stepping up so that continued testing of the Doherty to understand where it is in terms of the spread of the virus?
Yeah, well, we always work with the Doherty lab on the genomics, on everything that they can provide as further analysis, but it's really the epidemiological investigations that our interviewers of the cases and the contact tracers do to understand how it's moving across Melbourne.
And just on the 415 active cases we've got now, are you confident that's all back to the hotel for quarantine?
I can't say for all of our active cases. Obviously, the genomics will tell us something else. Some of the epidemiology will tell us something. But when there's community transmission without an unknown source, it's really only the genomics that can tell us about that relationship, because we don't have a clear link where someone identifies a close contact who's known from another outbreak or another cluster.
The numbers are obviously large the last few days, but they're not increasing. Is there comfort in that, or are we still looking at perhaps 1,000 active cases?
Oh, look, I get some comfort from stabilisation in numbers, but it is never an easy place to sit when you've got 415 active cases, all of which are infectious. Obviously, we've identified them. They're in isolation, their close contacts are in quarantine, but it's an indication of a very large number of people who've acquired it, which means there are other infections still to be found out there, and they're all at risk of transmitting to others if we're not doing the right thing. And so the restrictions that are in place, even though they apply to those restricted postcodes, we need to bear in mind that it's something for all of us to do, especially across Melbourne, but really the whole of Victoria.
So in terms of those criteria, are there other postcodes that are getting close to ticking enough boxes?
Look, it's really a matter of how they're trending over time with those postcodes. If numbers stabilise in those postcodes, no, they won't tip over into being a restricted postcode, but we're watching each and every one of them very closely. There's reporting on them continuously. And as I say, if they go into a kind of alert zone, that might be a prompt for us to really invigorate the testing and the door knocking in those areas so that we can drive numbers down.
So that's more of a weekly trend rather than a 1 or 2 day blip?
Yeah, it really is. It'll be reviewed more frequently than weekly, but it'll be on the weekly basis that we really get a good picture of how they're tracking.
How many people who are getting diagnosed are getting sick, and are you following up with positive diagnosis to track when they actually do become sick?
I'm not sure I understand the question entirely, but obviously there are 20 hospitalised patients at the moment. Of 415 cases, that's a relatively small number. It's 5%. They do talk about 20% of cases being severe with coronavirus. But with a younger cohort being infected, they're less likely to develop severe illness, less likely to be hospitalised. But again, it's of a concern that there are 415 active cases. There will always be hospitalised individuals when you get that number.
Is there any new data on how many people are asymptomatic, or?
We do pick up some individuals who have no symptoms at the time that they're tested. Asymptomatic really refers to people who never develop symptoms. They are a genuinely small number. I think it's very unlikely that many of them transmit to others. They become infected and it doesn't go any further. But a number of people will be tested have no symptoms at the time, but go on to develop symptoms in the next 2 or 3 days. So they're really pre-symptomatic individuals. They're different. They can transmit to others much more readily, I think. They're the same as other people who have symptoms, but we just pick up the virus before they've started to develop symptoms.
We're getting reaction from a few people who say they're worried about the people coming to their homes to test them. I know people with medical backgrounds who've said to me they're worried about the quality of the tests, that people aren't doing the tests right. How much faith do you have in the process that the tests are being done properly by people who are properly trained?
Well, I think Victoria has more experience now in people doing testing than really any other jurisdiction. It's a relatively simple test to do. I think the people who are doing it are doing a high volume of testing. Not every virus will be picked up in every individual. Sometimes the level of virus will be low, and even though someone's infected, it won't be at a level that gets detected. When people have symptoms, they're more likely to identify the virus. But I'm confident that the people who are doing the tests will pick up the great majority if there are people who are infected with it.
What about people doing it themselves with their mental strokes?
There have been studies that look into people self-administering the swab tests. The advantage is that it's more comfortable. People can kind of titrate how they do the test so that it's not extremely uncomfortable for them. It may not be quite as sensitive as when it's done by another operator, but again, when we're talking about potentially having people tested who would otherwise not be tested, I think it's a really valuable addition to roll out.
Just with the routine testing, I think it's 37 or 39, is that likely to be linked back to an outbreak later?
Yeah, very often those numbers that we are reporting every day as routine testing are people who we then interview, then identify a link. So we understand that they've got a relationship with one of our existing outbreaks, or that we can explore the links that they have to other known cases.
Are you able to provide not now, but sort of breakdown by postcode of these cases?
Yeah, I'm sure that we can provide a postcode breakdown of daily cases.
Have you been in touch with anybody in the Northern Territory about the case in Haddington? It's a person that travels to hospital areas and then travels to Northern Territory and tested positive.
No, I don't have any information about a Northern Territory case that might be linked to Victoria.
I think they're saying it is definitely linked to Victoria.
Right.
That's what I'm telling.
Yeah, look, it's a message that we've given to hotspots. You can't leave home except for the 4 reasons now. Obviously, if someone's travelled prior to that, that's not against the law, as it were, but we've got very strong recommendations, and I think that other jurisdictions have been really clear that non-essential travel outside of Victoria is not recommended by them.
Are more Victorians going to die because of this disease?
I'm afraid that that's absolutely a possibility when you've got significant transmission, when you've got 70 odd cases every day. There is absolutely an expectation that some of those people will die. That's why it's incumbent on all of us to be minimising our interactions with others.
Have you got any more detail on today's outbreaks and which clusters things are in?
I do. So of the new cases linked to outbreaks, 2 additional ones are linked to Al Taqwa College. 5 of the new cases are linked to Albanvale Primary School, 3 students, a teacher and another close contact. 1 is linked to a close contact of a known case at Stanford Plaza. 1 linked to the Wollert outbreak, a close contact of a known case. 1 linked to Villa Bambini in Essendon. Investigation into the source of this is being explored, including any potential links to a previous case that's known at this site. 1 linked to Springside Primary School in a student who's a close contact of a known case. 1 linked to the Patterson Lakes Listerfield family outbreak, another close contact, and 1 linked to a newly identified outbreak. And really this outbreak is illustrative of the challenges that we've seen and the reason for the restrictions being in place. A Roxburgh Park family, large extended family over at least 8 households, and now bring the total to at least 20. They're not 20 that are all reported today, but they're now known to be 20 from all of the links that we've made.
So how many identified outbreak clusters have we now got?
The total number of outbreaks cumulative, I think, is close to 87.
That are currently operating?
Currently operating, I'm not sure.
Just back on schools, with so many students being identified at Albanvale and does that mean, sorry, does that mean that we're seeing evidence of student-to-student transmission now?
There has been some student-to-student transmission and also teacher-to-teacher transmission at some schools. Again, when there's a heavy load of community transmission, more students getting infected, these schools have closed. The contact tracing that's being done, obviously for students and teachers who are now home. Nonetheless, the cleans are going on at the school, and the investigations into those school settings are ongoing.
Well, that's a worrying development, isn't it? Because that's something that we hadn't seen before in Australia.
Yeah, and we probably didn't have such a level of community transmission that we were going to see so many cases in schools. I also think that we weren't sufficiently pushing for testing of students or of kids, and maybe because we hadn't had a lot of cases in kids, there wasn't a real push. But we're now obviously engaging with a lot of families getting testing of kids at a household level, and so probably picking up cases that would otherwise have gone unnoticed previously.
Do you have an idea of how many student-to-student transmissions have been?
It's not clear because some of them might be from the same household, or they might be linked outside of the school setting. But we're certainly seeing some evidence of student to student and teacher to teacher, especially teacher to teacher transmission.
And
Are you
you're
still
comfortable-
recommending that?
You're comfortable with schools returning? in that?
It'll certainly be reviewed on a day-to-day basis. I will give as much notice as I possibly can around the resumption of school specific to the restricted postcodes. I think the expectation is schools will return, but I do want to see both that we're turning transmission around, but also that we don't have such levels of community transmission with students becoming infected that our resourcing is all focused on response to cases in schools, because we do need to focus our activity on all of the transmission across the community.
Should we be testing more children? There's been some reports that children under 5 can't get tested through the drive-through testing pop-up spots. Should that be something that we're focusing on, seeing as though we've got more kids getting infected at school?
Yeah, certainly kids are not as likely to transmit. That's pretty clear now. So they're less of a priority for testing, but I think it is important that we enable testing in children as much as possible. Of course, there are some settings where testing of kids can't be done, but with the saliva test that'll be used in some circumstances, and obviously with some other developments in testing, I hope that that enables us to at least get a picture of kids who might be cases as well.
We're seeing these extraordinary sights today of police stopping people moving between suburbs in Melbourne. We're in a pretty weird place right now. There's a lot of people feeling pretty frustrated. We live in those hot zones, angry, feeling they're being targeted. What is your message to them?
I understand that frustration. I'm not in a lockdown suburb, but I've got colleagues, and there are many staff in the department who are in those zones. You know, we all have to cop it on the chin. The alternative is that there's increased transmission, and that there are more and more postcodes, or all of Metro Melbourne or all of Victoria, that goes into a shutdown. When it's been out of control in places internationally, and continued to be out of control, it's taken weeks and weeks and weeks to drive numbers down. You know, Spain is now in a good position, having gone through a lockdown, but they had a period where there was 6 weeks where no one could leave a home at all, including children. So we have to accept that we're still in a better position than a number of places internationally, and that this is a really frustrating and hard sacrifice for people to make. But it is the appropriate public health measure to get on top of this. I certainly feel for people, and it's frustrating to see some areas where those restrictions aren't in place just across the road from where you might be. The point I would make is that the message is absolutely that we all need to reduce our travel outside of our homes. So the stay-at-home directions apply in law in some areas. There was always going to be a cut-off point where another suburb, another postcode was not under those same restrictions, but the message has to be the same. Otherwise, we'll all be in a worse situation together.
Is your message, do you feel like it's getting through, or do you think that people are apathetic?
I think there's a combination. I think definitely there's more conversation about us needing to do the right thing. I hope that there's a sense that we all have to pull through this together, because that's absolutely the case. It's never been more true than with infectious diseases, that it's our collective responsibility to get through this. But I also feel that some people don't get it, that it's being overblown, that 415 cases in a population of Metro Melbourne of 4.5 million is tiny. I can only return people to the notion that this entire pandemic that's now infecting 200,000 people a day globally started with one person and has killed more than 500,000 people. Having gone through maybe a quarter of the pandemic globally, this will be a pandemic that has the potential to kill 5 or 10 or more million people worldwide. And so we can't just look at where we're at today, because we don't want to go to a situation where this increases as it's increasing across the world.
Are we in critical months now? I mean, when we talked about the peak once in November and then it kept shifting, where are we at in Victoria and Australia in terms of that long-term projection?
There is so much uncertainty around long-term projections, because obviously we were trying to make projections around not having it under control, not being able to completely crush the curve. We showed that we could crush the curve. That's what we did in the first wave of this pandemic in Australia across the country. My intention is to do exactly the same with this wave, and to be in a position where a month from now we're talking about single digit, if not zero cases again. But that absolutely requires everyone to be doing what we're asking of them now.
Are you able to clarify what the difference is between the number of people from routine testing and the number of people under investigation?
Sure.
And why those things are different?
Yeah, so routine testing just means that we know that someone with symptoms went to a testing site and we've got a positive result from them. Under investigation means we've got a laboratory result and we don't know the reason that they've been tested. It might be that they're a close contact, it might be that they're part of an outbreak investigation, or it might be that they've gone to a routine testing site.
And on a different topic, the hotel and the CBD where people are taken when they do have COVID and they're being cared for by Alfred, people from the Alfred Hospital, are you able to name which hotel that is?
No. For the reason that there's no outbreak there, it's a controlled site. We wouldn't speak to any other site that doesn't have transmission or that hasn't had an outbreak. Obviously, we name outbreak sites where transmission occurs and where it's only appropriate that people understand that.
Are you concerned about construction sites and potential for contagion?
Look, every site is a risk now in Victoria. Construction sites are no different. We've been lucky in some respects not to have seen those sites with clusters, but I think we've also seen that people do the right thing in many of those sites. But you see a variation in behaviours across the population. That includes shopping centres where people are much too close together. So, I think there's essential work that's done in construction sites. They're doing really important work at the moment. And there are risks whenever people turn up to work unwell or whenever people get too close together when they don't need to be. But I would say that applies to a whole bunch of settings across Victoria.
Do you have a breakdown of the Auburndale primary, the 5 new cases, whether they were students or connections or anything like that?
Let me see. 3 students, a teacher and 1 close contact.
Just, I understand there's quite a few days delay in getting results back from Monash Health testing. What's the reason? Is it was concern? Should people avoid Monash Health sites?
I know that 25,000 tests a day are going to push out the testing turnaround times. We all have to be patient with it. Every bottleneck is trying to be addressed as best as possible. I don't think people need to avoid testing, but they should shop around for where they know that they can get tests, and GPs remain available to do testing, many GPs, and people should look on the coronavirus website to see where there are multiple testing sites nearby. There are so many now in Metro Melbourne and across Victoria that people shouldn't just go to the one or two that they might know of closest to them.
And has that program that we talked about last week, where the ADF is moving samples interstate to be tested in labs interstate, is that happening now?
Yeah, I believe that there are tests that are being flown interstate, so that can add to our testing capacity, and again trying to minimise the turnaround time for all of the tests.
Any idea how many?
I don't know how many. I do think it's a not insignificant addition to those 25 odd thousand. It's a few thousand.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.